Okay, I want to thank everyone for being here with us on Topical Tuesday. We will be covering a number of historical issues. Now, it looks like I won't be able to get this one post that I wanted to get up during the program for people to access, but what I will do is I will put a post of what I was going to post, only I will put the post up with an accompanying illustration of mine after the program is over. That way people who are listening through the audio archives can access it. In the meantime, I will put the post that I was going to put up into the, shall I say, text box here in the Skype for Laura Lee to share with the chat room. Now, I do want to remind people that on the positive note, or on the more heartwarming note, Christmas has been honored by many Western civilizations during wartime, and it is a holiday that was honored in particular in World War I when many European soldiers, primarily British and German, exited their trenches and ultimately crawled out during wartime to exchange cigarettes, alcohol, souvenirs, and just made a general peace. This was 100 years ago. And this occurred, of course, more closely towards the day of Christmas itself on December 25th in 1914. That was two-thirds of the Western Front, roughly 100,000 British and German troops spontaneously exited their trenches to exchange chocolates or cookies that they had gotten sent from their loved ones at home, etc., and sing Christmas carols. They should never have gotten back into the trenches, is what Judith Agert was saying. Of course, we don't really live in a world in which their superiors would have allowed for that level of continuity of peace, and therefore they ultimately went back to slaughtering each other within due time. Now, the hell of those trenches, of course, resulted in a kind of bonding even between enemies. One of the men who was in those trenches and earned himself no less than half a dozen medals was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, of course, developed a kind of bond with the British enemy during that period of time. There was always a deep respect between what he had felt was a fellow Ehrenvolk, or a fellow Aryan race, or at least a Germanic race that most definitively spoke a Germanic language. And because of that, he always had far too vulnerable a soft spot in his heart for the British population, and allowed, of course, the British Expeditionary Forces to evacuate at Dunkirk, actually giving orders on which to refrain from the advance of his armored battalions and regiments and divisions, armored columns is the correct term for it, through to the British establishment of an evacuation, and thereby eliminating the ability of those British troops to come and plague him in the future, whether in North Africa or on the continent of Europe itself. Now, personally, of course, I hope that he regretted that till the day he died. That was something that was not something that should be considered in modern war, in which there is no room for chivalry and no room for knighthood, when you are dealing with people, of course, who have no concept of honor or no concept of anything other than genocide. Now, that brings me up to one of the more controversial statements I made in my summary for tonight's program. I do speak, of course, that 70 years ago exactly today, the man who was most maligned throughout the Western world, Adolf Hitler, who is also hailed as one of the greatest of heroes throughout colored civilizations, he initiated one of the most analyzed battles in recorded history. That was the foundational basis for all NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, strategic doctrines. Per its original chartered mission statement, NATO's, as a defensive alliance of nation states under unified military coordination. Now, this operation that he initiated against the advisement of his general staff, as he often operated against the advisement of his general staff, was, I believe in the German it was called Unternehmen, and that would be Operation Bodenplatte Wacht am Rhein, meaning Operation Baseplate Watch on the Rhine. This was the Ardennes Air Force counter-offensive of the Luftwaffe in coordination with the armored columns that he had entirely restructured along Soviet lines. Now, this was unleashed tonight 70 years ago on December 16th, 1944, and the offensive lasted through January 25th of 1945. This was an absolute disaster for the American forces, despite their rallying and ultimately contending with it. All of the ability of the Allied forces to ultimately regain control of themselves was based on a number of factors that had nothing to do with professionalism on the part of the Allies. I'll certainly display that in a bit. In the meantime, I do want people to remember that one of the major Allied propaganda offensives of wartime was to constantly portray Adolf Hitler as a man who was unable to maintain sane decisions of any sort, let alone any sort of military acumen. Now, much of this propaganda sources from a sense of professional pride of the commissioned officer. It's very important to remember that Adolf Hitler was very much what we would call in the West a Mustang. That means somebody who advanced through the ranks from the bottom up, literally starting off as a squad leader and then ultimately taking over high command. Now, the reason that this is so important is because during the First World War, Adolf Hitler was witness to what many American soldiers were witness to during the period of the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War was, of course, a period of time in which the Americans had suffered underneath, quote-unquote, professional war management. Now, the professional war management, as we were subjected to underneath the American high command abuse of military power during the Vietnam War, was to engender defeat after defeat in the field and refer to it as a military victory. Now, great examples of that were how the United States Army was geared entirely towards battle on the continent of Europe. Now, I'm going to go into that, but that would bring us back first to the Battle of the Bulge, as the Americans have bastardized the reality of the Ardennes counteroffensive as conducted by the Germans. Now, it's important to also put into perspective Adolf Hitler's own sense of military acumen, something which is entirely unappreciated for the most part on the American public, because they've been subjected to an enormous amount of propaganda concerning, quote unquote, Hitler's inability to work with military operations. Now, Hitler's ability to work with military operations originated from his experience as a squad leader. So when he became a squad leader, what he had been subjected to, aside from the fact that men all around him were being chewed up to pieces in the machinery of modern war with no discernible objectives, with no objective other than to maintain a front. That is when he became enamored of what would ultimately translate into blitzkrieg warfare. Now, there's a lot of propaganda on the part of the German high command, in which the old Prussian Junkers, which produced the most excellent officer schools of Germany, that for years kept it on the cutting edge of professionalism. These warrior class peoples had to maintain a sense of identity and pride. Now, by the time of World War I, they were confronted with a kind of war they had never been confronted with before. A war of strategic weapons, a war of poison gas, a war of machine guns. This was no longer the war of heraldry and barons and knights that were leading men onto a field to face other men. This was a war of mass murder. So they were operating on a very old paradigm that only was beginning to be adapted to by men like the Kaiser who gave the initiative for bombing of Britain. This is when we had the first Battle of Britain take place using airships that flew at altitudes that the mere biplanes of the day could not reach. So they could not be intercepted by British defenders while the Germans were able to bomb with impunity. Now, this was an example of adaptation to total war that was, of course, one might say, an example of terrorism against the civilian population. So this would be something that would be reflective, however, of the fact that the British themselves had taken the Boer population, or the Dutch population of South Africa, throughout the Boer Wars, and interred them as men, women, and children. By that I mean literally children, the infants, the elderly, and the women who were not in the field doing combat were rounded up by the British under direct order of Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill put these children in concentration camps, where ultimately he killed as many as he could by starving them to death. So in terms of this individual killing women, children, and civilians on the South African front, he pioneered the blurring of the lines between civilians, populations, and the front lines. So in terms of combating a leader such as Winston Churchill, ultimately had proved himself through what were then considered counterinsurgency or colonial wars. We had the precedent which the Kaiser followed up on by taking the war directly to the British civilian population with the use of dirigibles. Now, by the time that we came into the Second World War, and we had a period of time in which Adolf Hitler, whose life had been spared by a British soldier during wartime. Now, anyone who doubts this can look up a completely vetted and historically incontrovertible story that a British soldier had Adolf Hitler in his sights. Adolf Hitler was injured, and the British soldier would not fire on an injured soldier. This is one of the reasons why there was a sense of honor that developed in the First World War by the men in the trenches, why they appreciated each other as soldiers. This was one reason why Adolf Hitler carried that with him up to the level of strategic warfare, where it should not hold sway, this sense of honor. He basically remembered his life being spared by a British soldier in the field. Now, of course, we come to the point where we have major war between civilizations, and we have a declaration of total war on the part of the Allies, Churchill and, of course, Roosevelt. Now, Churchill was issuing orders that not even his own men would obey in World War II. This is historically vettable. This is something that is proven. This is not a rumor. Churchill gave the orders to shoot medical evacuation planes during the Battle of Britain. That meant German planes bearing the Red Cross. That was internationally recognized for carting wounded pilots who had parachuted out of their planes, had been recovered, and were being flown back to the Reich. Winston Churchill gave the orders to shoot those down. To the credit of the Royal Air Force, the pilots refused to do so. Now, again, we are left with all of these decisions during wartime, but of course, the nth barrier was broken by the Allies first. And in terms of what the Allies were pursuing, it was a genocidal endpoint of the death of the entire German race. They called for the total and unconditional surrender of the German people. They were not calling on the leadership for surrender. They were calling on the German population for such. As for the German leadership, they did not count them as even existing. They said, we refuse to acknowledge the existence of a criminal regime. Therefore, what they deemed to be criminal would not be, shall we say, negotiated with. There were no negotiations. Therefore, there could be no surrender from the German government. Therefore, the entire quid pro quo logic was one of extermination. There was to be no end to the war until the last German had died. That was the high command's stance, that of Churchill, that of particularly Franklin Delano Roosevelt, And the end result was men like Eisenhower were left trying to negotiate surrenders in the field. Now, one of the men that he was doing this with was a musician who was a member of the big bands at the time. He even sent him on a secret trip to try and negotiate with a surrender with the German population, and as a goodwill ambassador. This was how desperate Eisenhower was, because he himself realized there was absolutely no way he could carry out a war of extermination and ever win, because the Germans would, of course, go into an insurgency mode, into a guerrilla warfare mode, and any general of any modicum of experience or intelligence knows you absolutely cannot win a guerrilla war. So because you cannot win a guerrilla war, the only option is extermination. And when it comes to thousands, even millions of people, that's one thing. When you're talking about tens of millions of people, you're left with a task that is essentially impossible. So it's not that Eisenhower had the moral qualms from exterminating the German population. It's rather he knew he never would have the logistical support for carrying on such a conflict. Now, we'll get more into the genocidal aspects of the Allied mentality and why it so failed in a moment. But to try and put Adolf Hitler's strategic acumen into context, that essentially proved itself in Operation Cobra, and it proved itself, of course, with the Feuillet Gap, the battle thereof, which most Americans are unfamiliar with because General Eisenhower himself did so much to hide that battle that would have otherwise been declared by the Allies a great victory. So what had happened was, of course, we had the situation of the D-Day Normandy invasion, the campaign known as Overlord. Basically, they became stagnant or stuck based on the defenses that were developed by Erwin Rommel. Now, in terms of what you ever saw in the movie about D-Day, The Longest Day, one of the first things that you saw was the opening scene where the actor who is portraying Erwin Rommel says, "Not one Allied soldier is going to reach that beach alive." Now, when he said that, that would either be a statement of braggadocio, of unfounded bravado that would look ridiculous to anyone who was listening to him, or it was a statement of a madman, or it was a statement of someone who had a new method of war up his sleeve. Now, the method of war, of course, that Rommel was concentrating on was that of atomic war. As a military man, he would have had no qualms about turning those beaches into glass. Now, of course, the Germans had the atomic bomb. There was SS General Jakob Sporenburg, who had his Polish war crimes affidavit, through his affidavit during a Polish war crimes trial, or a war crimes trial being held in Poland. He was an SS general, a Schutzstaffel general. He basically produced affidavits concerning the fact that they had developed the atomic bomb. I have gone into great detail of this in my various columns concerning that. Affidavits also concerning the interrogation of Luftwaffe test pilots released during the Clinton administration provided irrevocable evidence that the Third Reich tested the atomic bomb via what we today would call a very awkward, primitive, very large cruise missile. It was basically a very large rocket, not a V-2, but a V-5, as it was known. This was the delivery mechanism, and it was launched from the Isle of Riga. That was near what was known as Rocket Island or V2 Island, 8 months before the end of the war or the ceasefire on the continent of Europe, and it was several months before Trinity. This was in October of 1944. The mushroom cloud on the Baltic coastline was a full kilometer in diameter with continuous internalization of combustion, leading to electrical interference with instruments. Now, Great Britain put all of its constables, its fire departments, its medical evacuation teams within the civil defense infrastructure on atomic alert. Now, this is why the United States troops hit the D-Day beaches with Geiger counters. Now, all of this was, of course, known to General Erwin Rommel, and he was determined to deploy those atomic warheads on the beaches to basically turn them to glass and basically glass the Americans. and all of their allies, their running dogs. So at that point in history, of course, it was Adolf Hitler who made the decision that they were not to be used. Now, in this case, his decisions were based on something that Americans would consider insane, because Americans have no care for the environment, they have no care for other people's lives, and the more that they kill, the better, as will be demonstrated by what I speak about in terms of their strategic bombing campaigns. Now, in terms of Adolf Hitler, he felt that the deployment of the atomic weapon on the Baltic Peninsula, which resulted in the Germans being able to hold the Baltic littoral, Courland, Courland in the English, spelled Kurland in the German. The Germans being able to hold that well after the ceasefire on the mainland continent of Central Europe was made possible by the glassing and the creation of an atomic demilitarized zone, during which they were able to evacuate hundreds of thousands of civilians from Soviet extermination in the closing stages of the war underneath the auspices and the administrative organization of Gross Admiral Karl Wilhelm Dönitz. Now, Gross Admiral Dönitz of the Kriegsmarine, or the German submarine arm of the German Navy, he was made the final Führer of the Third Reich on the surface world by Adolf Hitler for this very reason, because his U-boats and many other ships put under his command were being used to evacuate civilians from certain death. Now, he evacuated hundreds of thousands of them under what became known as Operation Hannibal. Operation Hannibal was the largest evacuation of civilians to occur in the history of mankind. Now, his evacuating of all of these civilians back into Germany, into the West, where they would survive the war, prevented a Soviet genocide on the Baltic littoral of Germanic peoples. That would mean Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, which had been considered Germanized through the administration of the Teuton Ordnung, or the Teutonic Order of the German Knights, for hundreds of years. They were considered as Aryan or as Germanic as any Central Germanic peoples under the Third Reich definition of who was an Aryan German and who was not. Now, in terms of his victory in this regard, of course, totally unknown in the West, Adolf Hitler carried on, aside from saving all of those civilians, he also took towards recognizing the fact that the deployment of those atomic weapons resulted in massive radiation burns on enemy troops. The enemy troops they captured after the atomic bomb devastated their operational front lines were found to be dying of radiation cancer. They were exposed to radiation that was destroying them at the cellular level. Now, German geneticists of the Schutzstaffel, the SS, such as Dr. Josef Mengele, presented to Adolf Hitler the fact that there was no immunosystem that had yet evolved to sudden outbursts of radioactivity. It would be the same as no animal has yet evolved a hide that is thick enough or advanced enough in its molecular structure, such as Kevlar, to deflect bullets or to absorb the use of ballistic projectiles without causing an enormous amount of internal injury through bruising, etc. Now, not even the rhino has evolved that just yet, but supposedly, theoretically, if the theory of evolution holds true, rhinos should evolve a resistant hide to ballistic projectiles within maybe 500,000 years, if we keep shooting them. Now, that is, of course, absurd. For this reason, we developed Kevlar vests. We need the help now. Unfortunately, atomic weapons did not exist at the beginning of human evolution, and we have not evolved a cellular ability to stave off radiation as we have the ability to stave off various influenzas, the common cold to an extent, various other diseases. Our immunosystem is therefore obeying a certain Marquis of Queensberry rules when it comes to biologicals. However, radiation does not observe that kind of Marquis of Queensberry rules system, and it breaks right through all of the defenses and destroys the cell from the inside out, resulting, of course, in rampant carcinomas, the death of the host, etc. Once Adolf Hitler was presented with this information, he decided that nuclear weapons would never be used on the continent of Europe while he lived, that he would kill whoever was on his side that would try to deploy them first. Erwin Rommel presented him with an ultimatum and said, I care not for your ideology. As a military man, I must deploy those weapons since we have the technology to glass the Allies as soon as they hit those beaches. And Adolf Hitler said, in that case, you will die. And that resulted in the ultimate assassination of Erwin Rommel, who was, of course, given a hero's funeral. And it's very important to remember that Erwin Rommel had been one of Adolf Hitler's original blackguards, one of his original followers, one of the original brown shirt wearing members of the Partei. He was not someone who was a member of the resistance. That is all propaganda fantasy that was produced by the Allies after the war so they could rehabilitate his image for Allied political purposes, because the Allies needed various military heroes that they felt would be suitable for using for the Bundeswehr, the newly created West German army, in their creation of NATO. Because obviously there would be no NATO without a central participation of Western Germany and its military forces. So at that point in history, various men who were not, shall we say, to use the nomenclature of my father's time, Jew killers, various men who were innocent of participation in genocide such as the Holocaust, were taken, rehabilitated as military figures. Erwin Rommel was one of them. But the reality is that in terms of his career, he and Adolf Hitler had been very much dependent on each other, and he would never have taken up arms against his Führer. And as for Adolf Hitler, he felt compelled to ultimately take out Erwin Rommel because of Erwin Rommel's desire to use weapons that he felt were unacceptable. So Adolf Hitler felt that the radiation that would linger as a result of all-out atomic war on the tactical level on the continent of Europe would render an ever-genetic threat to future generations of Aryan man. And for that reason, nuclear weapons were not deployed that would otherwise have saved his regime. Now, again, were I in his place, my decision would have been entirely different, and I would have glassed the ass of the Allies as they came onto the beaches. Okay, but that, I was not in charge, and in that sense, of course, Adolf Hitler is obviously, in a moral perspective, the better man. Now, in terms of what happened militarily after that, thanks to the in-depth defenses developed by Erwin Rommel and the brilliance of Adolf Hitler, the Allies pretty much almost lost the war anyway until the Battle of Falaise Gap. And in terms of what that battle is, spelled Falaise, for people to look up. Once again, that's Falaise. The Battle of Falaise Gap was basically the situation where the Allies were stagnating. We had ultimately 3,000 Anglo-American planes that had to finally bombard a breakout barely 3 miles wide by a single mile deep, through which American armored spearheads could plunge out of the Normandy beachhead barriers that had been designed by Erwin Rommel, and they were able to plunge deep behind the lines of panzer armies of the Third Reich. They cut northeastward to link up with British and Canadian forces attacking to the south, and the converging Allied armies linked in a lethal pincer maneuver at Falaise. They snapped shut a gigantic trap on 100,000 Deutschen, or German, troops. This was a disaster for the Third Reich, the Third Empire State, that inflicted an epic defeat in the West, commensurate to the numbers of troops and the quality of the troops deployed there. That rivaled only the Battle of Stalingrad in the East. Now, this is an American victory that you think you would have heard of, the death of a Nazi army, something that the Americans would have shouted about to the heavens. But it was suppressed by post-World War II ceasefire Eisenhower's administration to conceal his culpability as supreme commander in the European theater of operations in failing to capitalize upon it. This was the single greatest Allied opportunity of the war. It was accomplished in wake of the attempted Prussian assassination on Adolf Hitler, no less. This was the opportunity in which they could have totally annihilated Hitler's armies in the West. It was actually conceivable at that moment. But it was let slip by an Allied command structure that was rife with national jealousies, conducting separate wars with no effective mediation from their supreme commander, General Dwight David Eisenhower, despite his promotion to 5-star generalcy. Now, he was ultimately responsible for the uncoordinated prosecution of the war effort in Europe, and he provided Adolf Hitler with priceless opportunity to masterfully recoup his losses and retaliate yet again at the battle that happened 70 years ago today, the Forests of the Ardennes offensive. And this extended the life of his regime into 1945, providing invaluable time to bring multiple emergent technologies to bear in advantage of the Reich's continuity of culture or its cultural survival and post-ceasefire influence on the Third World affairs and First World affairs as Der Drittmacht, or the third power. Now, this was made possible through propaganda campaigns and victories under Reichspropaganda Minister Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels, who used such technologies as what Americans call the Kraut balls, or the fireballs, multi-headed magnesium flares with extended flare heads that took forever to burn out, were radio remote controlled, sent buzzing after bombers and Allied planes, creating a sense of panic and the belief that aliens had intervened on the side of the Reich. Ultimately, this caused many of the Americans and the British to stand back, while, of course, the Germans plowed forward in evacuation efforts. Now, their ability to evacuate thousands and thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of civilians at Operation Hannibal should prove to you their ability to evacuate the leadership, their families, and, of course, an entire population base for reproduction into their various strongholds across the world. Why Americans doubt this in the modern day and age is due to their ignorance of operations like Operation Hannibal. Now, in terms of this battle, the Battle of the Bulge, what made it so important? You might think the Americans might study Operation Cobra. That was one of the most extraordinary phases of the 20th century's greatest struggle. It's where the Allied forces stormed Normandy to drive the Germans out of France, and even though their operation was successful, Erwin Rommel had created such a complex maze of in-depth defenses that it was only the beginning of this very long and bloodied road. And against all the hopes and desires of the Allied commanders, the battle to break out of Normandy slogged on for 7 long, brutal weeks, with an expenditure of lives and equipment that no one had been prepared for. Now, through 50 years, half a century of military history, we're into 70 years now, when we count up to our time today, Operation Cobra was overshadowed by the Normandy landing. And basically, people are entirely unaware of the fact that more than 10 times the howitzer rounds were used in breaking out of Normandy than were used in the landing itself. The British lost 32% of their entire armored force in Europe. Psychiatric casualties rose 400%. And this was just one of the many offensives that cost the Americans over 40,000 casualties. So D-Day was a disaster, and its disaster was based on the fact that even though Erwin Rommel was dead, the defenses he created were so impenetrable that the Americans came to refer to the bocage area of France as hedgerow hell. This is because the thick hedgerows, people in England are very familiar with this, being hedgerow gardeners, the thick hedgerows in France were hollowed out, incorporated by various tunnels through the hedgerow mazes, into bunker systems that were above ground, bristling with thorns, impossible to break through with shovels and spades. They were hiding machine gun nests, mortar emplacements, snipers. They took out everyone with every inch of ground that was taken. Finally, the Americans had to affix forklifts to the front of their tanks to break through the bocage area of France and what they called hedgerow hell. And all they were to face was ultimately the Battle of the Bulge, as they called it, or the Ardennes counteroffensive, which again almost broke them. Now, how did this happen? It really happened because the Allies were concentrating on killing civilians. Because they were concentrating on killing civilians, they didn't have the ability to deal with troops. Now, let me put this into perspective for the listenership because they're usually totally unaware of this. The Allies, of course, dropped 2 million tons of bombs on the Axis and one of their allies, Serbia. They killed 900,000 Japanese, 62,000 Italians, 24,000 Serbs, and ultimately they killed some 13 million Germans through the kind of genocidal actions that were taken by their allies, the Soviets, but through mass bombing on the part of the Allies, they killed a mere 600,000. But obviously, of all of the Axis combatants, when it comes to the amount of deaths, the Japanese had the most because they were living in bamboo houses that burned quite easily. At the same time, the amount of damages done on Japan's war machine were entirely insignificant. The Japanese population as a whole rose by a whopping 15%. By the way, this is entirely unheard of. This doesn't even happen in peacetime when people are celebrating with a baby boom. But throughout the war, the Japanese population increased by 15%. Their biggest problem after the war was overpopulation. Far more industry was damaged. This is historically vettable and undeniable on the side of Japan by local earthquakes than was ever damaged by American Allied bombing. It's the same in Germany. You had maybe 600,000 Germans who died on the West Front, basically women, children, and senior citizens at home amidst the firestorms. But what did it do militarily? It did absolutely nothing. One of the men responsible for this level of civilian genocide was, of course, a man known as Bomber Harris on the side of the Brits. And he was their top bombardier. He had an obsession with killing civilians that emerges from his own writings as maniacal. He disregarded the pleas of Allied commanders in the field for bombing the retreating German supply lines. He left the oil deposits untouched. And as a result, the Germans were able to evacuate in order and ultimately come back and attack the Allies with the Ardennes offensive. This is because the Allies were too busy killing civilians to take on soldiers and their war machine. The end result was, of course, while the Allies were stagnating at the Roer River battles, this was following the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead in July of 44, the German army, which they thought was on the verge of collapse, basically fanned out across northwestern France as the U.S. and British forces had done. All the enemy resistance they thought had dissolved into a headlong retreat to the German and Belgian borders. But in early September, this elated Allied high command, which had every expectation of continuing their momentum to cripple the enemy's war-making capability by crossing the Rhine and capturing the Ruhr industrial complex and plunging into the heartland of Germany, they basically paused for resupply of their own. Courtney Hodge's First Army prepared to punch through the largely outdated West Wall or Siegfried Line defenses surrounding Aachen. And, of course, the mayor of Aachen was so impressed by Allied might that he actually turned. He was not a member of the National Socialist Party. In other words, he was a non-Nazi. But Joseph Goebbels dispatched the Werwolf guerrilla movement, the National Socialist Underground, to assassinate the mayor of Aachen, replace him with a pro-National Socialist mayor, and they stood ground. So the Germans, they basically closed their own supply lines while the Allies were further apart from theirs. They solidified their front before the Roer River as an obstacle. They took basically ancient castle fortifications, like the castle at Metz, fortified these ancient castles with modern defenses, and during the lull in combat operations, the Lion of Defense, as Walter Modell was known on the German side, continued to reorganize depleted units, and they mounted an increasingly potent, aggressive defense based on a series of minor offenses. And they funneled all these numbers to the front, and basically were able to hold the line for months in a manner that depleted and expended an enormous amount of Allied lives. One of these was the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. I put up an illustration quite recently how during Christmas, combatants on both sides were so appalled at the losses that German and American medical corpsmen actually cooperated in the evacuation of the field dead. Now, with all of this going on in Germany during Christmas time, it's very important to remember that the reason they were doing this was unlike all of the propaganda books you've ever read, where they say the Nazi leadership or the German leadership was trying to help Allied, shall we say, German civilians surrender to the Allies. Okay, all of that is false. Any of the Allied or Soviet advances is disastrous for Nationalsozialistische leadership. Their entire objective was to hold as much ground as possible in the midst of their evacuation of themselves, their resources, the population which they considered to be of Aryan heritage. And because of that, they had these enormous fights which staved the Allies off in the West, to the point, of course, where they utilized children such as the Hitler Youth, the Hitlerjugend in German, to fight off both the Soviets and the Americans using guerrilla warfare or insurgency. And again, this is something which most Allies or Americans are totally ignorant of in their history books. They think of the French resistance, they think of the Polish resistance, they think of the Danish resistance, they think of all these various resistance movements throughout Germany or Europe, Festung Europa or German-occupied Europe, that were supported, coordinated by the United Nations, which was headquartered in the Presidio military base at San Francisco. This is why they produced a United Nations battle flag, known as the United Nations Honor Flag. You can look it up online. Basically a white sheet to be used for surrender, converted into a sheet or a flag or a banner of guerrilla warfare by painting it in 4 red stripes, possibly in human blood if you had to resort to that, but recognizable by the Allies as representing Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, quote unquote. And this would prevent you from being shot, since you were not in uniform, if you as a resistance fighter were to encounter Allied troops on your side. Now, people are familiar because of these efforts, and by the way, that United Nations battle flag / honor flag was considered in military use until 1948. Title 38 of the U.S. Code, which is law, says that ceasefire in the continent of Europe, in Asia, did not occur until December 31st of 1946. So until that point in time, Germany was legally at war with the Allies on the basis of their resistance movement. This is, again, something people miss in the West. They think of all of these other resistance movements, and they seem unable to comprehend the fact the Nazis would develop their own. So their werewolf movement, the resistance, was known as the Werwolf Insurgency. It's spelled W-E-R-W-O-L-F. It is not spelled with an E, as is used in the West. It is spelled with a much more feral-sounding Germanic spelling. And this was, again, all gamed out and calculated by the Nationalsozialistische long before the war took place, in terms of actual mobilized combat that was being used between both belligerents. What they had was a situation in which, as I said, they had developed the computer. They were using it to calculate how much of their resources that they had as opposed to Allied resources. They knew they had far fewer resources than the Allies, and as a result, they were able to deploy their resources effectively using various war games that they had calculated through the use of their computer technology, and figured out a way to hold as much ground as possible, steal everything that wasn't nailed down, loot Europe, and basically use that to pull out what forces that they could and what breeding population that they could in their retreat. Now, all of this was based on what they knew to be a war of extermination on the part of the Allies, and at the same time, the Allies were counting on technology in a way that they could not, shall I say, employ effectively. The Allies may have been genocidal in intent, but they were extremely uncoordinated and incompetent in employment of such genocidal technologies. Now, what is so astonishing is the fact that they couldn't defeat Germany within weeks. Basically, at the outset of the war, the Allies outnumbered the Axis. This includes Italy, Romania, Germany, Japan, Thailand, Manchuria. The entire Axis put together was outnumbered by the Allies in terms of population 10-1. And if we pitted the Allies, all of the three German superpowers against the Allies, German alliance superpowers of Japan and Italy, against Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. And it's important to remember Britain had over 1 billion people in their empire, all of Asian India. The majority of the continent of Africa was mobilized. So with all of that population base, as well as the technology of mass industry, because of all of the resources, their massive hinterlands in the United States and the Soviet Union, the massive hinterland of the British Empire, we basically had a situation in which they had 7 times the tanks, 5 times the heavy artillery, 3 times the combat aircraft, 5 times the trucks, 7 times the machine guns. And yet they took forever to conduct operations because of incompetence, corruption, basically a concentration on killing civilians instead of encountering the enemy on the field. And the end result was, even in an operational perspective, they almost lost the war. And the reason why? A lot of it due to the brilliance of a man known as Martin Bormann. Now, go back to that after the break.
You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Okay, we are back from the promotion of our station. Thank you for staying with us. I do want to remind people that we are a listener-supported station. Also want to let the listenership know that I got it up on my Facebook timeline, the post that I had been trying to get up earlier. The biggest problem was scanning the illustration. Whenever I produce an illustration, the biggest problem is scanning it, getting into the computer system, uploading it, and sometimes this just isn't done on time to have it coordinate exactly with when the broadcast starts. Now, the illustration that you do see is accompanied by an attachment. The attachment is weather effects during the Battle of the Bulge, which is what the Americans refer to the Ardennes counteroffensive as, and the Normandy invasion by Marvin D. Case of the Atmospheric Sciences Laboratory. Now, this was not released. It was not circulated until August of 1982. If you access the document, you will see that it says destroy after reading. This is a leaked document. This is a classified document. I am bringing it to you so that you can understand the fact that the only thing that got your allies' ass out of the sling was weather modification. Now, the first thing you will note is that he alludes to this indirectly. I have presented this in the abstract. The abstract is available on my post on my Facebook timeline. It is a general description of the terrain of the Ardennes-Aigel area and weather-related decisions concerning the final attack date and the buildup of the German offensive push are noted. Now, surface meteorological charts for the 16th and 23rd of December in 1944 are presented, and they show that a modified cold maritime polar air mass was over the Ardennes-Aigel area when the Battle of the Bulge began, as the Americans call it. Now, that modified is the key phrase. It was basically a cold maritime polar air mass that was made all the denser with Allied electromagnetic technology that was used to basically jam the works of nature. And this created a massive cold front that created inclement weather conditions so that the Luftwaffe could not coordinate with the offensive itself when it started on December 16th. Now, it's important to remember that the German name for what the Americans call the Battle of the Bulge is, of course, Bodenplatte, Wacht am Rhein. Bodenplatte means base plate. Operation Base Plate was scheduled for December 16th in coordination with the Armored Column Advance so that they could destroy all Allied bases of air support so that the Allies could not coordinate air support to counter, shall we say, affect the offensive that the Germans were conducting. Now, in terms of a Facebook link to the timeline, I'm certain that they can pursue that, or the Laura Lee can find that for me. She can go to the timeline and get that. I'm going to, before I go deeper into history, she can put that into the chat room for everyone to pursue. It's posted already. Thank you, dear lady. I'm going to basically go over my own sponsor and what our station needs to do before I get any deeper into history and into the weather war, into a bit of the genocidal conflict, what was motivated behind that, the differences between the developments and technologies of two very, very different civilizations that were pitted against each other at this point in history. Now, in terms of my own sponsor, I want people to know that I'm on air to bring this to you only through the auspices of the likes of Ben, Man of the Soil. Anyone else who wants to become a sponsor of my own, aside from Ben, Man of the Soil, is welcome to contact my manager, Laura Lee Solomon, through her email at Lorien@DouglasDietrich.com. And her, that's spelled as follows, Lorien at DouglasDietrich.com. So Lorien@DouglasDietrich.com is something to contact her if you want to help to sponsor myself, aside from Ben. Now, Ben, of course, is the Man of the Soil. He is a landscape builder. His staff is responsible for old-fashioned landscape service, serving Tucson, Arizona, from synthetic grass to flagstone paver patios. And they are your one-stop outdoor service providers. Give them a call at area code 1-520-544-7743. Or get that something was conflated according to my manageress. I don't see how that is. Lorien@DouglasDietrich.com is the correct address for my manageress. That is something that people can contact if they want to provide sponsorship. But the person who does so, I said your name. Conflated again. You contact Lorien Ann Fenton as opposed to Laura Lee Solomon. Well, I can't help it. They look alike, they sound alike, they're of the same gender, and they both boss me around. At any rate, people will get it right. I got the address right, at least. You can contact Lorien at that. Now, back to Ben. Give him a call at area code 520-544-7743. You'll find that phone number on display at his website of manofthesoil.com. And there you'll also find his Arizona contractor's license, 108391. He's been digging for the truth since 1974. God only knows what he's found and if he's willing to share it. Now, he's physically located, along with his staff, at their mailing address of 7925 North Oracle Road in Tucson, Arizona. You can write him personally at soilman@manofthesoil.com. All right, and there we have it for tonight. With that, except, of course, we have a fundraiser that is still ongoing. We've managed to cover a great deal of funding. We've raised $1,147. Now, we've got 16 days left. I know we can make $2,200. Now, $2,200 is something we need pretty much every month. Just pretend we were leasing a flat with a commune of kids in San Francisco. Now, when I use something like that, I don't mean kids, I mean teenagers. You have all kinds of poor, deluded teenagers who wind up in San Francisco thinking that they can eke out a living. They always get sorely disappointed and they leave. But while we have this constant rotation of deluded, misinformed individuals that float into our city ultimately to crash and burn, and wind up on the streets, either on drugs or go home to their parents and live a life of reconciliation. These people come to San Francisco and they find out that rent for a flat is $6,000 to $8,000 a month. Now, they cannot afford that, so they get a full-time job paying minimum wage, which in San Francisco is fairly high. Minimum wage in San Francisco has got to be something like close to $15 an hour. Now, at the absolute least, it's $10 an hour. Now, all of that goes into rent. So the average person pays around $2,200 a month for rent in San Francisco for their part of the flat. And what they do is they all share this flat, and none of them can afford to buy furniture. So you see everywhere in San Francisco, none of the flats have curtains, none of them have shades. They basically have these Asian screens that they fold and unfold whenever they want privacy, or if they're trying to prevent people from looking in across the street with binoculars or whatnot and telescopes, they ultimately have to tape up newspapers. So everywhere you go in San Francisco, you see taped up newspapers on the windows, Asian folding screens in front so that people can't peek at the girls and the boys while they're doing whatever it is that they're doing, usually screwing, because you have a number of boys and girls together in a very confined space, and they can't afford to do anything else because they can't afford to pay cable bills, which are astronomical. So that takes television out. So at any rate, it's a pathetic situation, and for this, they're sleeping on mattresses on the floor. None of them have framed beds, and in the end, all of it is just another, shall we say, manifestation of hell on earth. Now, to go away from their hell to the hell of war itself, the kind of civilization that created this was fighting against a far more effective and efficient civilization, as murderous as they, but murderous in the sense of contending with a group that they considered to be their racial enemy, that of the Jewish peoples in particular, which were being exterminated during the Holocaust. That began, of course, with something that I will ask Laura Lee to look up. Please look up Judea Declares War on Germany. And please take away that face rubbing its head if you can. I find that very distracting, Laura Lee. Don't ever put up icons like that if at all possible from the text box. And let's see if we can find a source. Thank you, dear lady. Let's see if we can find a source for Judea Declares War on Germany, and that was back in 1933, as soon as Adolf Hitler came to power. That leads to something that does not rationalize or justify in any way, shape, or form the Holocaust, but it contextualizes it. Now, what contextualizes the weapon the Germans had on their side was, as I've said before during Saturday Night Fire Alliance, the computer. It was a German engineer named Konrad Zuse, first name spelled Konrad, last name spelled Zuse, and Konrad Zuse basically was a German computer expert. He developed the world's first programmable computer. He worked with German statistician Friedrich Zahn, last name spelled with a Z-A-H-N, who was an SS member since 1933, who in turn convinced SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler to establish a covert Reichstabulation Bureau that would integrate Zuse's technology with IBM systems, and these IBM systems were developed by an American statistician of German descent named Hermann Hollerith, last name spelled H-O-L-L-E-R-I-T-H. He created the punch card data tabulator for IBM. Now, one of the major German companies, IG Farben, developed magnetic tape in 1935, which made the Zuse-Hollerith hybrid mechanism, the information processing system, it as a computer, even more powerful. Magnetic tape was actually much more useful than punch cards, which were far more expensive, and with the use of magnetic tape, these computers did the work of 300 clerks with only 15 specialists in a week instead of in 6 months. And because of this, there were many major applications, one of which was gaming out the war. They could feed in equations, example of warfare, that would help them figure out how the war would play out in the end. This was how they knew that the amount of resources the Allies had to pit against them made the war unwinnable on the surface world, and why they concentrated so heavily into evacuation. Now, of course, Martin Bormann was responsible because these computers were processing so much information, they were so valuable. Adolf Hitler asked Martin Bormann, where can we relocate them away from Allied bombing? Bormann said, New Schwabenland. Basically, it had been colonized since the 1930s. It was Germany's Area 51 without the tourists. They began to move concept weapons and computers to the Antarctic, hollowing out vast caverns to fit them and taking advantage of tapping geothermal energy to run them. This is one of the reasons why they faced invasion in the Antarctic by the British SAS, the Special Air Service, during the war in 1944. During Operation Tabarin, the SAS attacked but failed to dislodge the Third Reich from the Antarctic. And, of course, this has been written about in Nexus Magazine. You can look up Douglas Dietrich in Nexus Magazine, and you can look up, of course, the links concerning this. As a matter of fact, we might get those links from my producer, Laura Lee Solomon, not Lorianne Ann Fenton, who is my mistress and manageress. We'll get, instead, Laura Lee Solomon, my producer and a supporter, to provide those links to Nexus Magazine. Again, I'll hook them up for you to access after the show is over, sometime before tomorrow. Now, in terms of these computers, these were sterile, cool conditions. The computers overheated easily otherwise, and they became the central focus of science in the Third Reich. Now, in terms of all of this, this goes into much of what I've covered before, which ultimately leads to Unterland. Not what we're covering tonight, this Topical Tuesday. Instead, we're covering, of course, the Battle of the Bulge, why it was so heavily studied. Yes, thank you, dear lady. We will put links up from Laura Lee Solomon that can be downloaded for free by yourself. because I owe Nexus Magazine absolutely nothing. They basically took me into an ambush where basically everything I owned was stolen by U.S. intelligence services on Virgin Australia. Now, that, of course, is run by that horrible multi-millionaire whose name I forget, Richard Branson, I believe, and he is taken to flying UFO shills around the world for free. They can go on basically spouting off misinformation concerning ufology that continues to mislead the people as opposed to the truth, which I expose to you, which is vettable and provided by leaked documentation, which I have put up on my Facebook timeline and provided people in the chat room. Okay, so go to facebook.com/Douglas Duane Dietrich. That's how you can access what I have put up in terms of leaked documentation concerning weather warfare by the Allies. If you do not have a Facebook account, set up a false one. If you don't want the powers that be to monitor you, if you feel you have nothing to hide that's of any value or consequence, just go on as yourself, set up a Facebook account, and put a like on my Facebook timeline to keep it running. Facebook.com/Douglas Duane Dietrich. Now, let's get back into what we were speaking of in terms of the Battle of the Bulge, why it was so studied by the Allies. First off, what made it so devastating in so many ways, and what made it so brilliant on the part of Adolf Hitler? What was it that made it, say, any different than any of the other battles that had been conducted with Germanic efficiency that resulted in a total waste of Allied resources and manpower? Basically, you had a man with his back against the wall. He was refusing to use atomic weapons because he stood on a morally higher ground than the Allies, and he felt that he was fighting simultaneously against a racial parasite or destructive racial enemy. Now, this is not to promote his anti-Semitic ideology, again, to contextualize it. We have a link up called Jews Declare War, and this is in the chat room. People are welcome to check out guardian.150m.com /Jews /declare-war.htm. I'm not going to repeat that. People can look that up in the archives and access that particular article. Now, that is the most publicly accessible article we can find at the moment on Judea declares war on Germany. This is what happened in 1933 when Adolf Hitler ascended to power. The Jewish diaspora, mainly headquartered in the United States, but with, of course, populations all over the world, were rallied via this declaration of war to promote sanctions by lobbying for their host nations, wherever they lived in terms of their population's diaspora, to put the Third Reich under crippling sanctions that would destroy its economy before it even got started under Adolf Hitler's regeneration programs. Now, for this reason, a hostility began to develop immediately between the Jewish peoples and the National Socialistic Party. Adolf Hitler later on blamed the Jews and held them personally responsible as a population for the declaration of war on his nation by the Allied powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Since the capitalists and the Bolsheviks, along with the British Empire, were coordinating against him, he felt that this was coordinated by a common enemy, the Jewish diaspora, which had heavy population bases in all of those empires, and he decided that he would rid Europe of the Jewish population. Now, ultimately, he did this by extermination. Originally, this was done by trying to deport them. No one would take them other than Japan. This led to the establishment of Birobidzhan, the Jewish homeland, or in Israel in Asia, bordering between Manchuria and the former Soviet Union. This was ultimately conquered by Stalin and absorbed as the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. Now, all of these were Yiddish-speaking Jews, mostly Sephardim, and it was an entirely different, shall we say, culture, as well as ethnicity, from the people who were mostly of Turkic or Khazar origin within Central Europe, who were ultimately expedited in their resettlement to Palestine, thus creating the white settler regime of Turkic peoples within the Semitic population base of Arab Palestinians, leading to the ethnic cleansing and the genocide which took place there under the Jewish fascists. And these were indeed fascists. These were people who were basically consulted with the SS, were trained by the SS in their ethnic cleansing techniques, and ultimately applied them in the Levantine area. They were denoted for years as terrorists on the side of the Axis by the British powers. Now, one of their men responsible for the World Zionist Congress cooperated with the ultimate evacuation of Heinrich Himmler, who contacted them just days before the end of the war. Now, that's something very many people are unfamiliar with. I may put up a post about that in the near future. Other than that, of course, I've written about that in the Nexus Magazine articles. We will put links to that in the chat room. We will put links to that up in my own timeline following this program, if they're not put up before the end of the program by Laura Lee Solomon, my producer. I haven't conflated that name. Now, in terms of what was going on in the field with the war itself, a lot of energy was diverted into this genocidal campaign on the part of Adolf Hitler. Now, in terms of what he was doing with killing off the Jewish population, which he could no longer afford to deport, he was also confronted with a Solomonic decision into cutting the baby in half. Was he going to maintain the Jewish population and feed them while he worked them to death in labor camps, or was he going to kill them off fast and basically utilize their bodies for any number of purposes, such as fat from Jewish peoples for soaps, hair for the lining of various coats and blankets, the skins for various things? All of this has been documented. Now, was he going to utilize them as a resource immediately, as opposed to keeping them alive and working them to death? He was left with a choice of feeding his own people or the Jewish peoples, and he chose to feed his own. Now, all of this is from a very horrific, pragmatic standpoint, comprehensible. That is not to justify it, but it shows you his logic, what he was confronted with, why he ultimately made the decisions that he did to pursue a racial war simultaneous to the war that the Allies were conducting and attempting to prosecute against himself. Now, in terms of the Allied bombing campaign and its entire, shall we say, desire to eradicate the German population, the Axis population in general, it is something that I have gone into before. I'm trying to decide in the time that we have left, which is a little less than half an hour before the end of the show, whether to cover more of that or whether to cover some aspects of the weather war. So I think I'll go for the weather war briefly. Basically, what had happened during that period of time with the weather modification that the Allies were working with, they had developed, using Tesla technology, the ability to regionally modify weather by dropping temperatures and creating a vacuum or a vortex which would suck in inclement weather from the north. This could be done easily in the northerly continent of Europe, far more than it could be done in the Pacific. Therefore, the Allies were unable to deploy this technology in the Pacific. This was the early roots of HARP technology. While the Germans were way ahead of the game in terms of physics, in terms of the computation, the Allies were very far ahead in terms of weather manipulation. Now, this was used to their advantage to prevent the Germans from being able to deploy the Luftwaffe, which they had amassed, and the Allies didn't even know they had the capability to do this, which was why it was such a surprise. The Allies were using their weather war originally at D-Day so that Germans would think it would be impossible for the Allies to invade. This is what made the beachhead possible at all. Nevertheless, General Erwin Rommel, as I have already articulated, even in death, had created such an in-depth defense system, the Allies were almost destroyed several times en route towards the heartland of Europe after establishing the beachhead only through their use of weather warfare, which made it impossible to deploy Luftwaffe intervention against them on the beaches, and Adolf Hitler had already refused to deploy his ace in the hole because of genetic reasons for long-term health of the European peoples, the atomic bomb. Now, in terms of what had happened after that, the Allies were faced with a sudden counteroffensive at the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes forest, and they deployed the weather weapon again, mostly so that no air power could be brought to bear by the Luftwaffe. That's why Bodenplatte, which was the Luftwaffe's amassing of 1,000 planes that the Allies did not know even existed, did not take place until New Year's Eve, January 1st. As it turned out, of course, they were able to launch when the weather cleared because the Allied vortex-creating machines, which created the vacuum of air compression or decompression, which sucked in the polar vortex from the north, which had so far protected them from Luftwaffe intervention. This clearing of the weather allowed the Luftwaffe to attack and destroy about 300 Allied planes. It may have been as much as half 1,000. The problem is the Allies destroyed all records of this destruction, and most of the planes were destroyed on the ground. And since no lives were lost with those planes that were destroyed on the ground, the Allies were able to hide the scrap metal, literally hide the scrap metal, and prevent people from conducting an accurate count on the ground who may have been involved with German resistance. And because of that, the Allies claim that the Germans destroyed 150, 200 planes. At the most, they admit to 300 lost. In reality, it was still a catastrophe because the Germans had launched 1,000 planes and were able to destroy basically only one Allied plane between every two of their planes. The problem is, in the West, all of these were young pilots who had never before seen combat. They were led by a couple of veterans, and this was a suicide mission because it was top secret. Since the Allies were able to intercept radio transmission and had broken the German code, none of this could be announced in advance, and the deadliest weapon the Germans had against the Allies was their anti-aircraft battalions manned by the Hitlerjugend, or the Hitler Youth, which had been mobilized and were underneath the supervision of Hermann Göring and the Luftwaffe. Now, all of these anti-aircraft units manned by very sharp-eyed, very alert, very eager German youth. One of them later on became the Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger. All of these Hitlerjugend who were fighting against the Allies with their anti-aircraft battalions could not be informed for the potential of information leakage about Operation Bodenplatte. So the Germans knew that as soon as they launched these 1,000 planes of young, untested, untrained pilots led by a few senior operatives, that they were going to lose the majority of their planes to heavy anti-aircraft fire by their own Hitlerjugend, their own Hitler Youth, who would shoot them down en route to the Allied lines. Now that is pretty much what happened. This was the last gasp of the Luftwaffe in the West to basically take out as much of the German operational lines as possible, the Allied operational lines, as possible on the front lines in conjunction with the Ardennes offensive. Now, that occurred in such a manner as to take the Allies totally by surprise. It was only shortly after that the Allies were able to mount a counteroffensive in the air, but that is not what made this the most studied operation in the history of modern man. There were so many records on it, so many of them are classified, so many of them have been destroyed, and yet it's been the basis for NATO operations. Why? Because the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was organized as a defensive organization against potential Soviet invasion. Now, the whole point of the NATO alliance was that if the Soviets invaded, they had to be able to resist Soviet operational tactics, what was known as a multi-echelon style of attack. Now, the Germans had suffered this attack again and again on the Eastern Front, and Adolf Hitler, being extremely adaptable, unlike what the Americans say, being extremely multicultural, unlike what the Americans say, made use of multiple foreign units, even on the Eastern Front. Now, these Ukrainian units, these units of various Eastern Europeans, such as Belarusian units, White Russian units, or Cossack units, or the Soviet army, which had defected underneath General Vladimir and a number of other former Soviet generals, General Vlasov in particular. And people can look up General Vlasov, V-L-A-S-O-V, who was what is known today as a National Bolshevik. In other words, he was not a Tsarist officer, but a Bolshevik revolutionary who was antithetical to the cult of Stalinization. And as a National Bolshevik who believed in a national identity for Soviet nationalities as opposed to a collectivization and a multi-ethnic interbreeding, as was promoted by Joseph Stalin, a Georgian and a foreigner to the mainline Russian population base, Vlasov surrendered his forces to the Third Reich and ultimately participated in war against Stalin and the Soviet Union. Now, his National Bolshevik forces, along with many Ukrainian forces, various other Eastern European forces, were shipped under the brilliance of Adolf Hitler to the Western Front. People need to look up Eastern troops in Zeeland as, of course, what Germans used to refer to Nederland as Zeeland, Zeeland. Now, all of the Eastern European forces who were shipped to Zeeland were maintaining their Cossack traditions, their Russian manner of speech, etc. They had German uniforms, but maintained their Cossack caps, their great bear fur hats, etc. Now, this was to lead to a total breakup on the Allied front line. Because what happened was Adolf Hitler put all of these foreign units into the Western Front, and when they attacked during the Ardennes counteroffensive against the Allies, all the Americans who heard their various Slavic dialects coming over the radio had to assume that Joseph Stalin had switched sides and had joined Adolf Hitler against the Allies. This led to a total breakdown and panic in the Allied high command. And add to that Adolf Hitler not just incorporated ethnic units from the Eastern Front, he also incorporated Soviet tactics. The entire German Army Group Center was destroyed on the Eastern Front by Soviet-style tactics such as using paratroops who wore German uniforms. This was used by Otto Skorzeny and his commandos when they wore American uniforms and to break behind American lines. Whenever they were captured, of course, they were shot as spies, executed, but nevertheless they accomplished their purpose in waging havoc behind Allied lines using this manner of Soviet deceit. Also, the Soviets used far smaller tank battalions than the German divisions. Adolf Hitler learned from this and broke up his massive German divisions into much smaller tank units or columns that were aided by what they called Panzergrenadiers or various militia units, which were raised from the German Volk or population to accompany these armored battalions with a mobilized population base very similar to Mao Zedong's guerrilla units used in communist China. Now, because you had these Volksgrenadier or People's Grenadier battalions along with these much smaller armored columns, and the Russians, of course, were famous for using Katyushas, or rocket launchers, Stalin's organs, which had decimated German front lines with massive waves of rocket attack. He also learned from this tactic and deployed what the Germans spoke of as Nebelwerfer. Nebelwerfer is smoke thrower in the transliteration. These are multi-headed mortars that are the German version of Stalin's organs. Nebelwerfer can be looked up online and research it by looking up Nebelwerfer in the singular and with an S at the end for the plural. Now, the Nebelwerfers broke up the Allied front lines. The Panzer Volksgrenadier came in to follow up and mop up behind the much smaller tank columns, which were able to pierce without putting a massive collection of armor that would be vulnerable to Allied air attack onto the field. And they followed this up by breaking up, or preceded it by breaking up the Allied logistical support lines and headquarters command units with the German commandos that were dressed in Allied uniforms. All of this was a Soviet multi-echelon attack, ultimately backed with former Soviet troops that were coming in, speaking in Russian. So this was the closest that Western Europe has ever experienced to a Soviet invasion. This is why Adolf Hitler's use and adaptation of Soviet populations, Soviet tactics, and operational format proved he was probably one of the most adaptable military commanders in history. Far from the propaganda that you are fed about him as being someone who had no concept or acumen of military strategy. On the contrary, he was far more brilliant than Eisenhower or any of the Allied high command, or the war would never have lasted that long. Now, this is why the Americans had attempted, along with the British, to assassinate him. One need only look up Target Hitler or various other BBC documentaries to find out that they were attempting to assassinate him throughout the war. As a matter of fact, anyone who does research into assassination attempts on Hitler will find that there were hundreds of assassination attempts against Adolf Hitler, all of which failed, as testament to his personal security and what ultimately was concluded by the Allies to be his precognitive ability. In other words, he was concluded by Allied study under J.B. Rhine, last name spelled R-H-I-N-E, of Duke University, to be possessed of precognitive powers, that he could sense every time someone was trying to kill him. That's why, when a bomb was placed on his private plane, he decided not to take that flight. Or he knew it wouldn't go off because it would freeze at higher altitudes. He intuited this. Now, this happened multiple times. He was saying a speech in one hall in Germany and left early, and that's when a bomb went off and destroyed everybody else who was there. Now, this happened time and time again throughout his life. He had what was undeniably a sixth sense that helped to provide motivation for Allied and Soviet studies into psychic warfare following ceasefire on the European continent. Now, in terms of all of this, we have a person with nigh precognitive abilities. We have a person with strategic acumen. We have a person that the Allies hate and fear and propagandize against to this very day, because he was the one man who came that close to destroying them and threatening them. And aside from all of that, his use of these tactics provided an opportunity for the West to see what it would be like under a Soviet attack. For this reason, the Battle of the Bulge, as it's been bastardized, the Ardennes counteroffensive, is the most studied, analyzed, back-to-front battle that has ever taken place in military history, because it was the foundation for NATO's operations in the event of a Soviet invasion, in which, of course, they would be using German troops as the foundation for their defense against a Soviet-style attack. Now, in terms of how this misfired, was creating an entire United States Army that was based on maintaining that kind of warfare, when it failed so miserably in the first place, and they were still using it in Vietnam. Now, what do I mean by fail? It failed for the Allies in terms of any defenses that they had. To put this into perspective for you, that because at the Battle of the Bulge, 2 entire American infantry regiments surrendered. Now remember, this is when the Allies were convinced that Germany was left without air cover. This was in 1944. This was just prior Christmas, when the Allies were propagandizing that they would be home by Christmas. This was during a period of time when the Allies had bombed and killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. They thought they were on top of the game. They thought that they had the war won, and yet they were surrendering in droves when confronted with the Germans in the field. Now, what does this tell you about Allied forces, aside from drawing the obvious conclusion of cowardice and just ineffectiveness, unprofessionalism, the lack of any sense of warrior ethic? What you have is a bunch of men who realized they had no control over what had happened on the ground because they'd been too busy killing women and children. And suddenly confronted with armed men, they surrendered. They threw down their arms. And that is what you see take place at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, compare that to Vietnam. Throughout the entire Vietnam War, the big scapegoat, what the Americans used to blame for all their failures, is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, A-R-V-N. And the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was one of the finest armies in the world. During the 1972 offensive, the ARVN 3rd Division collapsed along the demilitarized zone. and only one regiment surrendered to the communists. And that was the only surrender of a South Vietnamese unit in the entire history of the Vietnam War, which had gone on forever. Until the bitter end, during the North Vietnamese Army's multi-divisional, fully mechanized armored sweep into Saigon, there was no surrender of Army of Republic of Vietnam or South Vietnamese Republican Army forces. Yet, during the Battle of the Bulge, with all the advantages, the Americans are surrendering at the regimental level. Now, how does that compare in terms of this so-called warrior culture, which Americans are constantly busting themselves up at as being? They're blowing their chests out, they're puffing themselves up, and basically it is the most fallacious of propaganda stances. It is all bluff. Their performance in the field has been historically execrable or execrable in English, because they're capable and organizationally indoctrinated and ultimately organized for the killing of women and children by massive bombing. That is why throughout the entire Vietnam War, they dropped 5 million tons of bombs on North Vietnam and more bombs on Laos than in all of their concerted bombing campaigns in history. In other words, all of the bombs dropped on Italy and Japan and Germany put together was nothing compared to the 5 million tons of explosive ordnance they dropped on Vietnam alone, not to mention more on Laos and Cambodia. Each one of those nations, they dropped around 5 million tons of bombs each. Now, each one of those nations alone suffered more bombing than Japan, Germany, and Italy put together throughout all of World War II. That's what America is all about. And in terms of its massive bombing, once it comes to work in the field, then they fail. And despite this failure, their entire military, the United States Army rather, was geared towards that methodology of warfare on the fields in Vietnam, overwhelmingly geared to meet the Soviet Army on the plains, Germany, and they were opting in the field in Vietnam for search and destroy tactics, which ultimately destroyed the United States Army, and it was ultimately defeated. Basically, we have a situation in which the enemy could choose when to engage because the U.S. Army's march into the field tactics in Vietnam. And because of that, the enemy engaged the United States when it wanted to in Vietnam, the Communist North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, and ultimately wound up taking out thousands of servicemen that didn't need to die. Now, that was probably one of the major decisive reasons why I joined the Marine Corps. Because these search and destroy operations in Vietnam that the United States Army pursued, and keep in mind, it was those Vietnam officers that were leading us into Iraq. Just as in Vietnam, all the Vietnamese Army of the Republic of Vietnam, if it was in liaison with the United States and the U.S. Army forces themselves, were being coordinated by commanders who were veterans of World War II. So you have a misapplication of what lost them the field in World War II being used by officers on the field in Vietnam. Then you have Vietnam officers who are leading us into the Gulf War. Well, I didn't want to be led by Army officers who were familiar with search and destroy in Vietnam, because as a working doctrine, it totally failed. It resulted in basically the Viet Cong initiating 80% of all platoon and company-sized engagements. But the Marine Corps favored clear and hold tactics because they'd been in Asia for generations, and they used what they called CAPs, or combined action platoons. They were focusing on pacification of villages and hamlets, and this resulted in the destruction of the Viet Cong and their infrastructure. Now, this should have been the focal doctrine of the American policy and strategy, as opposed to the Army paradigm, and that's why there was a chronic conflict between the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army about the methodology of warfare. Now, to my great dismay and ultimate disappointment, of course, the Marine Corps hadn't retained any of those lessons from Vietnam. You would have thought that those officers from Vietnam would have learned all of this and more, and there would have been, indeed, a racial tolerance in the United States Marine Corps because of their long period of time in Asia. Okay, none of that occurred. Everything I was to discover was to be the exact opposite. There seems to be an entire inability of the U.S. military in any branch to learn anything from the last war that they've ever fought, which is one reason why I can guarantee you they lose every war they ever fight. So we could go into that for hours, and of course we're pretty much at the end of the program. We've got basically a few minutes left, and one of these days I will go into, perhaps on Saturday if anyone calls in about it, and I do appreciate people calling in on Saturday, by the way. Certainly we need more people to call in. I do ask anyone who has anything to say against what I'm saying to call in. And that is the entire point of debate in the classical Athenian sense. This is why people would get into debate. The entire point of debate is to lose, because if you lose the debate, you win, because you've learned something. The person who's put the effort into proving you wrong on the debating stage isn't gaining anything. So the whole idea in the classical sense of debate is to learn. Now, all of that has been perverted, and what we have today is a desire for one-upmanship and dominance. Now, unfortunately, because that's the tone that is set in the modern American social intercourse, that is the tone I have to take. And oftentimes, I've taken that tone, but I've never used it against callers. So make certain that you're not intimidated by any anticipation of my eviscerating yourself on air. You are more than welcome to call with a divergent viewpoint or perspective. We have, of course, a modicum of restraints concerning civil discourse. We are going to have people refrain from ethnic slurs, gender orientation insults, any sexual identity denigration, anything concerning swear words, particularly the F-bomb. All of that would, of course, get you banned, along with any threats of lawsuits. Of course, any station has the right to ban anyone permanently from calling in again when they're making threats of litigation. So with all of that outlined, we do encourage more callers. It's worked out well enough in the past. We basically have a long-term callers, or by that I mean callers who call, and they're basically on for the entire show, almost as a kind of impromptu interviewer. I mean, I can work with that, but the point is, we do try to encourage building up a queue. We seem to be able to handle that now technologically, so we want that to work out more in the near future. So I do continue to reemphasize that. Now, we've only got a few minutes left, and I think we've hit the end of the show. Thank you very much. Join us on Saturday Night Firing the Lines. I did hear something from the music, or something was coming in. Either that or I'm beginning to hear voices in my head. At any rate, I want to thank everyone for the patience that they've had in dealing with my historical lessons for the evening. Hopefully they prove constructive, and hopefully people have something to pursue in terms of further research. We'll get some links up concerning my Nexus Magazine articles on my Facebook timeline soon enough. And as always, of course, here's some other links from Wikipedia, of all places, the bathroom wall of information intercourse, as Gary States has said. One of them will talk about Jewish boycotts of German goods. Look that up on Wikipedia. Also, there is a Judea Declares War on Germany article out of all places, www.BibleStudySite.com/Judea War. .htm. So people who are listening to the archive can replay that and link to that as soon as possible. Now, because we've had some difficulties with exactly when our advertising goes on air, I do want people to remember that we have, let me see, a few days left pretty much until Christmas. I'm thinking if there's anything else I need to remind people of for the evening until next Saturday. We've got basically almost a week between us now and then, and I think that next Saturday is before Christmas. Is it not, Laura Lee? I don't have a calendar in front of me, so I'm going to count on you to tell me. And if we happen to miss each other, the listenership and myself, I do want you to have a very Merry Christmas. Yes, it'll still be before Christmas, so we'll be able to exchange those pleasantries with those who call in. And I do hope, by the way, as a person who had a battlefield consecration. I might explain that probably on Saturday. To Serbian Orthodox Christianity for reasons of my contracting with that community, that royal family, the Karađorđević dynasty of Yugoslavia. During the 1990s, they live in exile, of course, and are no longer recognized as the official monarchy at the moment, which is why no matter how old they are, they're the prince and princess. My Christmas for Serbian Orthodoxy and Byzantine Church in general doesn't come until January 7th. So, okay, till then, you take care, have yourself a great week, and we'll speak again soon.